Shabbat Shalom. Before I moved down here to sunny Orlando, I was living up in Baltimore, in the first pulpit I had after my ordination. And Baltimore is an amazing city, especially Jewishly, but also as part of American history, both Jewish as well as generic American history. It is absolutely central to many of the major events that have happened in our country's life. For example, that thing hanging over there. What is famous about the item over there and its connection to Baltimore? The Star-Spangled Banner. Do I mean the Star? Exactly right. I had a good fortune of being able to not only visit the fort above which the, quote, Star-Spangled Banner waved, or yet waved, as in the national anthem, but also to see the original Star-Spangled Banner in the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., which is basically a suburb of Baltimore. That's not the way the Washingtonians usually phrase it. Who were we fighting during that war in which the Star-Spangled Banner yet waved? The British. Now, was this our first tussle with the British? No. So why were we still fighting them in 1812 when we had already achieved our independence? Because they thought they'd give it another go. Or perhaps more importantly, they thought they'd come back and finish the job. See, well, perhaps I'm speaking out of turn, but we, in my elementary school and high school, we were taught that we won the Revolutionary War because of our revolutionary gumption, because of our American tenacity, because we would hide in the bushes and shoot them with our snipers while they were stupidly walking around in ranks of redcoats. By the way, that is a complete myth. We did not win because of our snipers and huntsmen hiding out in the bushes. We lined up in blue uniforms on the opposite side of the field because it turns out that was the only way to actually engage an army during that particular time of military history. You weren't going to defeat an army. You might wear them down a little with guerrilla warfare, and we certainly did, but we also had to meet them on the field, in ranks, lined up opposite them, going bang, bang. So how did we win? Because honestly, if you look at the American colonies, and you look at the British Empire of the late 18th century, we did not have nearly as many people to go bang, bang as they did.
So we push, for example, and we received the help from Spain and France. We put pressure on Britain and Europe, so they need to diversify the troops, and they decided that it's not a good idea to fight in two different fronts. So that's why the pressure, we got pressure from all the countries, not from us. That's why we
All right, excellent summary, but let me make sure that everybody can hear the gist of that. I will also add that they had mediocre leadership among the people in America for the British Army. And George Washington, despite some of his flaws, was actually a pretty good general, at least as we needed at that moment. For what we needed, he actually did a pretty good job. But the most important element for our American success and independence were the non-American allies that supported us and caused more trouble for England in places that were more important to England than we were. I know this may hurt our feelings. We were not the most important territory in the British sphere of influence. The Caribbean was much more important and lucrative to Europe, as were the Far East Indies, and those were areas that England had a much bigger interest in maintaining its physical presence and defending against both French and Spanish incursions or jeopardy for their sphere of influence. So basically in 1789, in 1776, eventually the British decided we were not worth the trouble right then. They had to go deal with the other bigger problems elsewhere. Once those other problems were done, then they could come back and deal with us and put us down, and hence the War of 1812. Which saw the burning of the White House and a lot of other major catastrophes. How did we win that war? Napoleon. Because Napoleon was resurgent in France, and England had to rush off and put down the bigger threat on the continent of the resurgent Napoleonic Empire. And again, we won because we were not the most important threat to England at the time. And if that hurts our American pride, well, I'm sorry, our pride should be built on facts rather than myth. Now, in the process of eventually giving us our independence, or rather recognizing our independence, did England ever say, you know what, that whole declaration that you guys had, when in the course of human events, da-da-da-da-da, you had a good point there. They never admitted that. They never said, you know what, taxation without representation is indeed unfair. You are absolutely right. We should have let you go long ago. This was terrible of us to treat you like this. What's that? They abolished slavery within their empire. Right. Absolutely. England did abolish slavery within their empire before we did, and they also attacked the slave ships of other places long before we would ever consider such a thing, because, of course, that was the way of attacking the economic interests of their competitors. It was not just because of morality. No offense to the British Empire, and certainly not to my wife, but the British Empire... She'll watch the recording. The British Empire never really acted out of moral high ground on any of their behaviors. And that is true for their eventual recognition of our independence. They recognized it as a fait accompli, borrowing from the French, that they just had to put up with, but they never said that our revolution was actually right. We are still colonial rebels who just got lucky by circumstance, but honestly, we didn't have a legitimate claim to independence, and therefore we never should have broken away. Of course. Exactly right. The British could not only would not, but could not recognize the legitimacy of our claim to independence because they had other territories that they did not want to be infected by the idea of local rule for all of these colonial territories. Imagine if the Irish got wind of the idea that maybe you should be allowed to govern your own country rather than having to produce raw materials for the mother country that had taken you over. Well, that would cause no end of troubles, which, of course, it eventually did. Imagine if India got whiff that maybe it was inappropriate to have some tiny island nation, a tenth of your size, halfway across the world, being able to decide how the people within your territory would live and die for the profit margin of their companies that are based back in England. I mean, next thing you'd know, you'd have an independent India, and Pakistan and Bangladesh, and then the whole empire would dissolve, which of course it eventually did for precisely that reason, but about 150 years later, because the British were not willing to actually embrace this concept that was enmeshed within the American Declaration of Independence. I mean, neither were we completely either, but that's a whole nother conversation. Now, what does this have to do with Torah? Well, in order to understand the exchange between Pharaoh and Moses, and most importantly between Pharaoh and God, we have to understand it through the lens of the politics that we've just been discussing. Time and time again, throughout the Torah portion that deals with the haggling between Pharaoh and God, we hear that not only does Pharaoh harden his heart, but God will harden or stiffen Pharaoh's heart. And I can tell you that from my discussion with many different students of all ages, this is one of the passages in the Torah that bugs people the most. They hate the idea that somehow God is setting Pharaoh up to be the fall guy just so God can have his big, splashy Exodus moment. And in order to understand it, we have to take it apart politically. What was God hoping to achieve with the Exodus from Egypt? What was the goal? I'll give you a hint. It was not to get the Jews out of Egypt. That was a symptom or a corollary that would go along with the goal, but that was not the actual goal. It's okay for your father to raise his hand. He's a teacher. He knows what it's like.
In verse 7 to 8, with that the book of that they teach to the Egyptians that there is a God over the Pharaoh and over everything else, because the Egyptians they are very obvious when the Pharaoh believed that was a God that controlled the nature and everything. So he wanted to be sure that to teach them that there is a God over them. And the next 8
Let's get that part out first for everyone. Right? So the first half of the sentence of God's goal was to establish in the mind of the Egyptians and the Israelites, who were a little iffy on the whole thing, and perhaps even the rest of the world, but the Egyptians would do for the time, that there is a God, and that God's name isn't Pharaoh. That there is an actual, real God. Not just statues and idols or people that claim to have divine authority, but that there is a real God that is beyond the limits of humanity and beyond our control and beyond our ability to adopt its form and function within the society, that there is an actual God and that is going to matter. But of course, the second half of that is, why does it matter? Because that God actually wants the people to be free. Yes, the people being free, like I said, is an ultimate result of God's goal. But it was the implication, the declaration, that actually the Israelites should not be slaves. That in fact there was a right way to live life that was not based around the whims of a particular pharaoh or a Queen Victoria or anyone else, but that there actually was a God who had a goal for the world that involved people not being subservient to people pretending to be gods within their own countries. And in order for that to work, Pharaoh had to play his part. Now, by play his part, I don't mean be a puppet, but I mean Pharaoh had to actually capitulate only for the right reason. Look back again at the example that I gave you of the American Revolution, or the Colonial Rebellion. The British never admitted that we were right. They eventually acquiesced that they had no more ability, no more capacity to retake the colonies or to stop the rebellion in the first place. And thus they accepted the facts on the ground and walked away. But they never said we were right, that it was correct or proper that we did this. It was power versus power, and their power eventually was unable to overcome our power. Now, God could have played the entire power game with Pharaoh. Indeed, like I mentioned in the introduction to the Haftorah, between Egypt and Babylon later, between Egypt and others in prior generations, power was the language of the empires of those days. But God did not want to be seen as just another power that was forcing Pharaoh to do what Pharaoh didn't want to do, and force Pharaoh to act out of fear, to act only out of weakness. God needed Pharaoh to be strong. He needed Pharaoh to have the courage to do what was wrong. He had to have the guts to do what he actually wanted to do. Because what Pharaoh actually wanted to do was keep the slaves and murder a few every now and then when they got too uppity or when they became a perceived threat, and to expand his empire and to exploit his own people and to act the role of God on earth. That was his absolute desire in life. And God wanted him to live out that fantasy to the full. You want to be like that, Pharaoh? And indeed, pretty much your entire national culture thinks this is the right thing to do? Go for it. Show me what you got, because I want you to eventually recognize that that is going to fail. And the only way you'll recognize that it's going to fail is if you actually give it your best shot. If after you recognize, wow, they turned this whole river into blood, we're dealing with something a little bit beyond our means here. You know what? Off you go. Phew, we dodged that bullet. Anyway, let me go back to persecuting these other people. That would have been a failure for God's mission. If all he had done was got us out by one display of power, oh, a staff turned into a snake. Oh, yeah, out you go. I'm not dealing with you folks anymore. I'm going to go pick on someone else who's weaker. That would have been the British Empire solution. Eventually they said, we're going to go pick on people that are weaker, and we're going to improve our colonial apparatus to make sure that this kind of thing doesn't happen. We'll keep them weaker. And that wasn't the precedent God wanted to set. God did not want Pharaoh to give in because Pharaoh was bullied by someone mightier than Pharaoh, so that Pharaoh could then turn around and continue bullying people that were weaker than him. God wanted Pharaoh to capitulate completely after having given his best adversarial attempt at challenging God. And that's what we get. Throughout the 10 plagues, the back and forth and the courage that God gives to Pharaoh, the hardening of his heart is not stubbornness, it is courage of saying he is willing to go toe-to-toe with clearly a superior force because he believes the superior force of righteousness is wrong. And that was essential so that we could have the proper lesson from the Exodus. Not God was able to get us out because God was more powerful, and power always wins. But that we left because at the end, even Pharaoh recognized it was right. He regretted that, unfortunately, but for a moment he understood what was right. For a moment he understood there really was a God, and it wasn't him. For a moment he realized this culture of persecution, of slavery, of oppression was not correct. And that yes, these Israelites should go and be with their God. He quickly regretted it when he saw what it was going to cost him from the accountants. But for the moment, he understood. And that moment of insight, that flash of precedent, just like that flashpoint of American independence, is able to stand despite all of the other problems that come around it. All of the backsliding that happened with Pharaoh, or indeed even within our own country, of what we meant by all people being made equal. That flashpoint could withstand it and could still stand as a symbol, as a beacon, for what was actually meant to be. It was a higher ideal that withstood the test of time, that it continued to inspire not only our people, but people around the world. The message that God established through the Exodus of Egypt indeed did raise the banner across the world in a way that the American independent movement kind of did. God, of course, no offense to our founding fathers, succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. Indeed, were it not for the Exodus, it is hard to imagine the American Revolution ever happening, or indeed any movement towards the freedom of individuals. The Exodus established what was right and where we would derive what was right. That we would look to the nature of this world, we would look to the fabric of reality that God had crafted to understand what was good, what was right, what was just. And that we wouldn't let people oppress us, even if they had the power. We would resist, we would fight back because God was on our side. God is on the side of what is right. God is on the side of what is just. And that hardening of Pharaoh's heart may feel cruel, tricking him into thinking he had a chance of winning. But it was essential to make sure that no one after Pharaoh would ever honestly think they did have that chance of winning. We had to establish that precedent. Pharaoh had to play his part, and he willingly did so. And thankfully, that has allowed the world to continue to unfold towards a closer and closer imitation of the ideal of this world that God has in mind. May we continue to walk that path. May we continue to draw ourselves closer to that ideal. May we always see in the drama of the Torah our drama of ourselves and of the struggle that continues. Shabbat Shalom.